As I learn, we all learn podcast coming 2022. So stay tuned, family.
Astro project, blast of attack, pass your neck with the shit to leave a rapper and Rex from the back of a black Acura. Bullet ricocheted and it's swayed and it's passed through your pecs. The assassin wet. All y'all know y'all don't have to go. Sawed off shoddy, make you potty, probably call the law. Me no gangster, I'm no tough, got me child of the most high. I get on the mic and you go, bye bye. Devil don't test me, I throw shrapnel where your chest be. Shooting our family down in the streets. Fuck the police, they ain't marching for me. Pull up, not that Rari, I ain't bad yet. I pull up out that 85% of mass at. I put this on God, bad black is so hard. Bitch, I'm going back to Harlem in my West African garb.
Peace to everybody out there, man. This your boy Sean P, or you might otherwise know me as Any Red, Sean Calfani. I'd like to thank everybody for tuning in to the show, Archaeological Review of the Cowerie Shell Connection in Africa. Please like the show, share the show, tell a friend. I'm not gonna lie, I'm going to exhaust a lot of information on you today. So please have patience and, make sure that you take notes. Timestamps are key when we get into this type of information. That's why it's a literary review, and we're going to, have an opportunity to get into some things that we may not usually do on the occasion. I also have some the sources in the description of this bill. Now, I do have some books that I did not include in that, and just in case I need to refer to my books, then I will provide you with that information as well. So please like the show, share the show, tell a friend. I'm pretty sure someone else is live at the moment. I think I seen a notification pop up just a few minutes ago. So if you're interested in Deuteronomy again, you know what I mean? It's not going to be the show for that, or dealing with the Hebrew thing, the Hebrew narrative. It's not the show for that. So I appreciate everybody rocking with us. For those of you who will catch the review, please do your due diligence by liking the show, sharing the show, and subscribing to the Mossy Warrior Clan YouTube channel. Let's get going. So the reason that I am actually doing this, right, is because this is pretty much hypothesizing here. Pretty much believe that we assume that cowrie shells, when I say we, I'm talking about African Americans, and even some continental and diaspora and other diasporan Africans believe that certain cowrie shells are indigenous to the continent. And which one of those shells, we have no idea. It's over like 4,500 or something like that, different type of cowrie shells that's on the continent right now. And we need to really get into the essence of that, right? There's been some claims that have been made regarding cowrie shells and trade, especially dealing with the Remech and brothers and sisters of West and Central Africa. Also, there's been some claims in regarding to that connection, showing a parallel between this diffusionistic mindset. So we need to get into what the archaeologists are saying about cowrie shells and their presence in early African history, and just deal with it from a true perspective. You know what I mean? You have some people trying to make that connection from east to central to west to the new world. And I hope that's not the case. So I do want to say peace to everybody that's out there tuned into the chat. Peace to Sister Safa, Donnie, Tony, Juju. I think he was in here earlier. Sister Benita, Double R, Robert Rand. What up, Ramon, Trick Gear, and Trickcher, and Mongo. What up? What up? What up? What up? And what up, Mo? What's good? What's going on? See, Sister Mo in the building. Yeah. You should have been there, Mo. But it's all good. You know what I mean? We actually have it recorded, not from Facebook Lives, but we actually have Vance. He recorded it in its entirety. So when the editing is done and everything is put together, you guys will see the finished product of yesterday's vaccine discussion at the Black Dot Bookstore. Nice little intimate crowd, you know what I mean? Uh, some books were sold, several books were sold. You know, you see Sewu Jao was in the building, and Sanet Imiket, you know what I mean? Made the cameo, so that was love. You know, you had Kent and Vance, the pseudo killers representing, doing their part. But before we get going, though, make sure that you on your cell phones. If you're on your cell phones, adjust your quality in your advanced settings, and go to 720, because I am going to be sharing a lot of information, and I am going to be talking a lot, and I am going to be walking everyone through. So I appreciate, yeah, it's gonna be another one. I appreciate everybody tuning in again. Like the show, share the show, and let's get to cooking. So again, remember, it's my hypothesis that people all over the continent are under the impression that a lot of the cowrie shells that are on the continent are indigenous to the continent. Um, and also we have this narrative that because of this thing, this via trade, this commerce and things of that nature, that um, that links a particular people with one another. There's 4,500 different cowrie shells is on the continent. Um, and we're gonna have to deal with what we need to deal with to get through that. But hey, hey, nah, when the video goes up, it goes up. Y'all are here about it to see it. So let's get into this information right now, man. Kofi's in the air traveling right now. He might be landing shortly. He probably, yeah, he might be landing. I don't know. He might be still in the airport or whatnot. I don't know. I don't know. Everybody should be like headed home or whatnot. So, um, all right. So everybody can see my screen now. I am going to stay right here on the introduction of this. So, in this one, it says Cowries in the Archaeological present day picture. So I'm gonna go ahead and give it to you like this. This is it. Cowries in Archaeological West Africa, the present picture. This is published by, written by Ann Hoare and Elisa Christie. Now, they are from the Sainsbury Research Unit for the Arts of Africa, Oceania, and the Americas, University of East Anglia, Norwich, NR4, JTJ, 7TJ in the United Kingdom. This article was received in 2018, July of 2018, and was accepted a year later, pretty much almost a year later. All right. So I'm not going to get into the abstract. It's not my thing. I want to get directly into the meat, right? Um, so in the introduction, it says two Indo-Pacific cowrie shells, Monteria Monte and Monteria Andalus, have caused much ink to flow in reconstructions of West Africa's past. So I want you to immediately identify with, hold on, let me fix this. My bad. All right. To identify with the two Indo-Pacific cowrie shells that have caused a lot of ink to flow. All right, so we have a destination here already from the Indo-Pacific to specific cowrie shells. Now, often known in literature of Cypre monte and Cypre annulus, these marine uh, gastropods are, by virtue of their source, frequently mentioned as markers of Africa's global connections. Their role in West Africa's social fabric suggests a deep history and today oral traditions evidence the centrality of cowries as a symbol in West African thoughts. Despite historical ethnographic significance of cowrie shells in West Africa, their occurrence in archaeological context has not been systemically reviewed. Cowries are often inconsistently reported in archaeological literature, and while most publications will indicate whether cowries were recovered and in what numbers, fewer state which species were present. All right, now, so fewer still provide useful further details such as shells conditions, any evidence of modifications. You have particular whether the cowries are back, i.e., have their dorsums and the dome part of the shell pierced or removed, or whether these modifications are likely to be natural or anthropogenic in origin. Now, assumptions are also often made regarding the probable function of perforated versus unperforated shells, or ornamental use versus currency, for which there is no known evidence. The time, therefore, seems to us to be ripe to consider the question of the spread and the uses of cowries in West Africa from an archaeological perspective. Now, accordingly, the present paper uses evidence drawn from a systemic standardized assessment of over 4,500 cowrie shells from archaeological and museological collections. All right, here's a little image here of the cowries, front and backs. All right, showing you different grooves, and you see there's different sizes. All right, now remember, accordingly, the present paper used evidence drawn from a systemic standardized assessment of 4,500 cowrie shells from archaeological and museological collections across West Africa from a chronological spread running from the 10th to the 19th century. And as listed in the figure 2 table above, you can see these illustrations. So we're dealing with cowrie shells, in particular two, um, from the 10th to the that goes through from the 10th to the 19th centuries. That's a long time, especially with these two particular cowrie shells. Just relax, Tony. All right. Now, our research has only been possible thanks to the generosity of colleagues who allowed us to examine the assemblages in their safekeepings, and the acknowledgments hope to reflect our depth. First-hand examination of the shells circumvents many of the issues linked to published materials and allows us to evaluate the extent to which oft repeated historical narratives are mirrored in the archaeological record. We draw too on the understanding of living cowries to inform our interpretations. We set out to address the following questions. To what extent do cowrie shells represent archaeological assemblages, reflect proposed narratives regarding the chronology and trade mechanisms for the two key Indo-Pacific species? All right, which is Monetaria annulus and Monetaria monte. Now, do regional variations exist between assemblages in terms of shell size and modifications? What role do cowries play in West African communities? So here's a map, right? West Africa. More specifically, you might know this as the Bight of Benin, the Gold Coast area. Yeah, going on through. You're familiar. If you look on this map, let me try to see if I can zoom in a little bit for people who can understand what's going on. All right. So you got the ocean out here at the bottom, of course. If you see the triangles, they're representing pre-12th century Squares is 12th century to 15th century. Stars are 15th century to 18th century. And then the post 18th century are circles with dots. And then I guess the diamond would represent the unknown. Okay. So if you look over, this is Mauritania area here. But you would see some triangles and diamonds here. If you look at Senegal area over here, on down to the Senegal, the Gambia, the whole nine, and just walking you through everywhere else. West Africa, you're gonna see a lot of triangles and some unknowns, which would be diamonds. There's one star here. Then you got the circle with the dot here, Ghana. Um, and then you have Ouagadougou and all those areas. You'll start seeing them here, but this is where those cowries were really heavy, all variation types, real heavy here, especially when Nigeria and the whole nine. Yeah, get into that, those cross river connections, all of that. All right. Again, is another an outlook, a little centralized version dealing with the Gulf, or what they call the Gulf of Guinea, but you already know this. You should know what these are. 'Cause look, you got the River Volta here, River Niger coming on back bend. Yeah, River Benue. See, you can see all of these pretty heavy as far as time periods. Okay, so we begin by discussing cowries as living animals. That's what they want to do. When we outline what was known of the spread of cowries in West Africa based on historical sources and the issues that become apparent when these sources are confronted with archaeological data, next we present. Let me back out too deep right here. All right, there you go. All right, so next we present, let me read this out and I'm gonna come back. This table right here. The methodological guide or analysis involving consideration of shells, species, size, and modifications before moving on to discuss both regional and finer grain patterns in terms of the shell size and species. So above here is the continued chart, as you can see for the next few pages in this particular published article. These cowrie shells, or the locations, as you can see, site names, Mali, Senegal, right? So the names on the sites are here on the left-hand side. Let me get in a little bit closer. All right, so the names here, the areas here, the number of cowries. So look, in Mauritania, 34, 33 cowries, number of cowries, all right? It tells you in context where they got them at. If they're excavated from an archaeological site, and then they give you the chronology in the center. So I'm not going to harp too much on this. This is why I provide all my sources, so I don't get stuck on trying to explain mappings and so forth. All right. Now, plus this is for another conversation. So when things begin to heat up in another direction, you know what I mean? You can go and corner the information. So introducing living cowries, commonly found in low energy tidal zones in warmer waters. Now, remember the two specific the Indo-Pacific region cowrie shells that we're talking about deals with Mauritania, Monte, and Monte and Andalus. So we're just going to call it Monte and Andalus. All right. So Lorenz and Hubbard, my bad. So while these ranges are thought to include areas from the Red Sea to Hawaii, historical texts from the medieval period to the 19th century insist on identifying the Maldives and East Africa as the source of the cowrie shipped to West Africa. In later periods, the Pacific areas have been important. The collection and sale of cowries in the Philippines is mentioned by a 16th century source, Quagagin, who suggests that they were likely exported as far as India and Africa. However, we think it unlikely that they were a major contributor to Africa imports in early times. An origin of the Red Sea of Northern Arabian Sea is possible, and Lawrence and Hubbard include these areas within the natural range of these species. However, we have not found much archaeological data to shed light on this. Cowries of many different species were of great significance in ancient Egypt, featuring in well appointed graves, often in association with beads or other ornaments. All right. Now, our study has therefore focused on the Maldives and East Africa. While both Monte and Annalise occur in the Maldives and along the East African coast, they are not equally abundant. Ecological surveys along the East African coast highlight strong dominance in Annalise and Monte. This was confirmed by our own systemic collections in Tanzania, while our surveys in Maldives suggest the opposite and true in Maldivian waters. But the province of a given cowrie in an archaeological assemblage cannot be assigned based on species alone. Suggestions have been made over the years that Monte and Annalise also lived along the West African coastlines. This is a mistaken understanding. So the reason why these two shells are important is because they're culturally, seldom used culturally when we're dealing with Africa. All right. So when we're dealing with those things, it is that these two are the two. Now, confront. So I want to like read this again just to slow it down. So key uh, conco- conchology texts do not include West Africa within the range of these two species. That is key. Okay. Now I'm going here so y'all can see where I'm at. I was here. Now, as suggested by Jackson and Lawrence and Hubbard, Monte and Annalise specimens. Let me make sure that y'all can see that if you're on your cell phone. Let's scroll up. All right, right here. Specimens collected along the coastlines likely represent lost cargo from shipwrecks or items dropped while disembarking. So these two shell types right here, Monte and Annalise, also live along the West African coastline. This is a mistaken understanding. Okay? These are likely represented by lost cargo from shipwrecks or items dropped while disembarking. Confronting evidence from informants in Cotonou, Benin, specifically, who declared that they collected cowries locally, Oroko noted that while the shells they showed him were indeed of the species and a loose, they never contained remnants of the live animal. The conclusion is therefore that both Annalise and Monte recovered on West African shores constitute beach wash. While Monte and Annalise do not live on the West African coastline, other cowrie species do. Although they are not equally abundant or common, these are Styracoria, Lorinda, Lorida, and what is that? Chalderia achade, and Zanira Parum, and Z Zanari. These are shell names, the shell types. Z Sangalulinta and Z Picta. Five of these reportedly occur commonly in environments theoretically readily accessible to human collectors. That is to say, intertidal or shallow water. But one of these, Zanoria picta, is restricted to the Cape Verde Islands. These leave four key contenders, the distribution of which are shown in Figure 3, and all which we have identified in West African archaeological assemblages. But the problem is with two specific calories. Snowball, I just got started. Now, into West Africa, the received wisdom. So the presence of monetary analuse and monte in archaeological assemblages is often interpreted in light of historical narratives concerning the chronology of mechanisms of the Cowerie trade, sources of supply and species selected. Now, in a nutshell, these hold that cowries reach West Africa through two main channels. The first is terrestrial via the Sahara Desert, which shipments thought to have largely comprised Monte and presumed to come from the Maldives. The second is maritime via the Atlantic, thought to involve a higher dominance of the Annalus and presumed to have been sourced from East African coast. At present, this is no conclusive evidence of an east-west route across Sahelian Africa, a matter discussed in context of cowries by Hiskett in 1966. So a chronological distinction is also implicit in the geographical division. And as the Atlantic trade in association with European contact in the 15th century AD, the presence of Annalus is considered evidence of relatively late date. Monte suggests earlier contacts. So you have, remember, the two main shells we're talking about. You have an early date and a late date on both of those shells. On one of the shells, right? One has it earlier than the other. Monte is earlier contact, um, and the loose is later contact. All right, both of those are Indo-Pacific. It's their origin place. All right, they just so happen to end up on the coast via some type of trade, shipwreck, whatever. Okay, now York has pursued his suggestions to assess in archaeological correlates in Ghana. Johnson speaks of watershed of divide between northern Sahara and southern coastal networks. She and Jane Hagedorn envisaged an intermediate area where tenuous links were maintained between the two zones along the major trade routes. Similar history believes that the medieval Cowerie currency area of the Sahara hardly extended south of the Niger, while Errico has suggested that in the least parts of the middle belt of West Africa between the 17th and 18th centuries, both types of cowrie circulated equally, although they were scarcer than on the coast and on the Niger Bend. Archaeological work is the only source of data that can enable us to assess these hypotheses. Since historical sources are non existent for many parts of this forest and savanna area until the late 18th or even late 19th. So here's a table 2 chart, an abundance of shells occurring along West African coast. And this a bunch of the shells that were mentioned. You can see here Cape Verde, Angola, Senegambia, Ghana as the 4 main type. You see some shells that come from Spanish Portugal to Gabon, Morocco to Angola, and then you see the Senegal to Angola perspective. All right. And we get an offshore bathymeter. And we get, yeah, for those of you that are into all of that oceanic stuff, this is probably good for you. Panther said he was reading about this the other day. Yeah. All right, so this is the geographical range of 4 common West African cowrie species. So this is what I'm talking about, right? And right here, if you look right here, if you follow my arrow, next to the kilometers, you will have the shell types, right? So anyone looking to really get into the 4 main types, that's where you're getting them and how they coming. So let's be a little bit more specific. This twofold model was based on a number of historical sources. The early historical information relating to the spread of cowries through trans-Saharan routes comes mainly from North African and Middle Eastern sources. The early historical information relating to the spread of cowries through trans-Saharan routes come mainly from North African and Middle Eastern sources. Now, The first mention of the use of cowries in sub-Saharan Africa appears to date in the late 10th and early 11th centuries, when the author of Akbar el-Zamin, writing in Egypt, reports that they were used as ornaments in women's hair. You remember when I said I could stop, pull a book out, corroborate the source? Give me 1 second and I'm actually going to do that for you in this demonstration. Vitzian and Hopkins, 2000, page 35. All right. Akbar Zalamin. Yep, Akbar Zalamin. All right, now an account of Kanem Ham. So this is some religious information going on here. I'm just trying to get to the point of where the cowries are mentioned. 3 days, copper rings with women. Okay. All right, so in on page 35, if you own the book, Corpus of Early Arabic Sources of West African History. This is the book that they're referring to. I know it doesn't say the book name here, but I actually have the text. So they're talking about trade here, and they're saying they put copper rings on their hands and in their ears of their women. Red dyed karawayi are brought to them, but they are worn only by the king. They have a huge tree and make feast every year in its honor. So what they're describing here regarding the gold mines of Ghana and how the people are looking basically is that these cowries are being worn and donned as jewelry at this particular time. There's no currency available for this. This is all accustomed to their glitz and glamour and how they, it's kind of rocking things. But I'm not through going through this. All right. He says here, where you go? El-Wadib Duma el-Malik entered Egypt and possessed it. Then it occurred further south, further source along the Nile. Yeah, he's just talking about how these cowries traveled and what they donned them for. It doesn't get too much in specific in this, but let's continue. I'm gonna keep this book to the side because I can go in there and corroborate more of what's going on, particularly in this part of the book. In the 11th century, al-Bukhari states that cowries were among the most sought after commodities in a place called Kogu. Back to the same source, page 83. I can flip on over to 83 and we can substantiate the claim. So it says among the provinces of Ghana in a region called Sama, but they are talking about Kagu. So I'm gonna skip this first paragraph and get to the paragraph where I see Kagu. It says, west from the town of Ghana is that of Anbara. Its king named Tarim is opposed to the ruler of Ghana. 9 stages from Anbara and 15 from Ghana is the town of Kagu, the people of which are Muslim, though the country around is inhabited by polytheists. Most of the gods imported there consist of salt, cowries, which they have the name as Wada, copper, and euphorine. All right, so I'm gonna read that again. It says, west from the town of Ghana is that of the Anbara. Its king named Tarim is opposed to the ruler Ghana. 9 stages from Anbara, 15 from Ghana is the town of Kagu, the people of which are Muslim, though the country around is inhabited by polytheists. Most of the gods imported there consist of salt, cowries, copper, and euphor. Now, the later commodity and cowries are the wares most in demand there. In the surrounding county, many of the gold mines, this region is most productive in gold in all the lands of the Sudan. This is also the town of Lakwan, the king of which Khamir B. Asi, by name, they say is a Muslim, but conceals his religion, which is, that's it. So now we know the area and what they're dealing with regarding cowries. Now, in the first half of the 14th century, al-Umari describes cowries as currency in Canaan and as a currency and an import on which vast profits were made in Takura. So now you got to go all the way to 260 to 269. I'm already at 260 for some reason, one of my little highlighted areas. All right. And he talks about in 260, al-Umari, he gets into describing pretty much the kingdom of Mali and what appertains to it. Leading up to that, he is basically summarizing some of the, in context, some of the details of what he was witnessing and then the influence of Islam in the area. But when they get into the descriptions of the kingdom, they're being a little bit more specific as far as who's doing what. But the involvement, as stated in this particular paragraph, regarding the Canaan and currency is valid, but it's just too many pages to get into because you get to read it in this full context. But for those of you who are following along with what I'm actually doing, I'm actually showing you how to vet your sources, especially when you have the written literature in regard to what you're reading with these archaeological digs and sites. You asked me what book I was reading from. I mentioned it a second ago, but I'm reading from the early corpus, the corpus of early Arabic sources for West African history. That's the book. It's written by these two people, Levitzian and Hopkins, published 2000s. All right. So, but while these sources provide useful insight to its nature of the cowrie trade and the use of cowries in sub-Saharan Africa, they are desperate as well as silent regarding the use of shells further south in the forest areas. Remember, two shells from the Indo-Pacific, not indigenous to West Africa, that are the cause of concern as far as decorations and currency and so forth. All right. They enter in between the 10th and the 19th centuries. More so, uh, the earliest evidence that we have is especially when we have the Muslims coming in the area and they're documenting things. They're telling us that a specific type of cowrie ornament in Egypt was worn in people's hair, but it makes its way to West Africa around the 11th century. All right. So the question of the occurrence of imported cowries in the forests and coastal regions of West Africa prior to the Atlantic trade is interesting. The existence of local shell currency in Benin City, Nigeria, possibly involving cowries prior to European contact, has long been discussed. Now, Ogodoran's suggestions that cowries were present in Yoruba world, though in small numbers and primarily employed in ritual contexts, is based on cowrie-shaped reliefs on ceramic vessels from Ife, issued from 12th to the 15th centuries archaeological context. Do I get garlock? No, I ain't got garlocks. Cowries as well as copper and glass beads would presumably have reached Ife through trans-Saharan trades. That Ife had wide-ranging trade connections is not in doubt, given the widespread distribution of diacritic blue glass beads thought to have been made there. The assumption is that the cowries themselves have not survived in the early archaeological record. This taphonomic argument has also been made in the cause of the 10th century site of Igbo Ekwu, for example. Given the extraordinary ranges of items at this site, including thousands of beads, the excavator Thurston Shaw wrote that it was difficult to know just how to evaluate absence of cowries. He suggested that either soil conditions were not conducive to the survival of these shells, or they were simply not used in the area. At Benin City, Kano, proposed that the condition of the few cowries recovered in excavation was so poor as strongly to suggest that specimens in earlier deposits may normally have been completely dissolved by soil. Remarkably, however, 5 cowries were excavated in 3 separate features at the Benin Museum site in contexts totally devoid of European imports. At present state of understanding, these appear to predate European contact and therefore remain tantalizing. So once European traders become involved, an additional body of historical information becomes available, which, though patchy, is relatively plentiful. The use of cowries is especially well documented along the Bight of Benin. The first major shipment of Maldivian Monte cowries into West Africa via the Atlantic reportedly arrived in Benin via Lisbon in 1515. I want you to think about what I just said here because that was especially significant. So we have here, right, the arrival of an Indo-Pacific cowrie shell in the Bight of Benin in 1515. This is our first major shipment. All right, so this shows us actually getting one of these imported cowrie shells via trade. Okay, now from then on, the use of from the Europeans, they bringing these. They already having contacts with these people otherwise, but they're bringing them to West Africa. So from then on, the use of cowries, especially as currency, is thought to have spread from that point on, 1515. All right. So that by the end of the 16th century, they've been adopted in Alida and were spreading to the Yoruba hinterlands. The data relating to the regions now in Benin and Nigeria have been particularly well discussed. Ogundaran highlights that cowries were by far the dominant import to the Bight of Benin during the period 1650 to 1880 and were widely established as local currency for commercial and social payments. Cowries were intricately tied to the slave trade. It's that old Bight of Benin. All right. You see Whiter down there. You heard that mentioned on another show. You also mentioned a lot by people who don't want to be African. But anyway, let's continue. So the cowries were intricately tied to the slave trade, to the New World, and Ojadorn and Johnson suggested that 18th century peak in the slave trade was a major reason for cowrie imports also reaching record levels then. It is thought that Wida or Wida was probably the greatest importer of cowries at that point. Cowries, textiles, and European goods were shipped from the coast against slaves, livestock, salt, textiles, and other goods. That's out of Lovejoy's. By then, it is suggested that the cowries had become very common in central Sudan, roughly southern Niger and northern Nigeria today, to the extent that the Kano Chronicles mistakenly reports that this was the time of their initial introduction to the Hausa area. Hodgdon and Johnson follow Hiskett in suggesting that this may indicate an intensification of exchanges of slaves for cowries between Kano and the coast. Thus far, the story is thought to have concerned Monte shells, but by the early 19th century, cowries are reported as being in heavy demand in settlements at Ouida, Alada, and Lagos, from where they were sent to Dahomey or Oya, Hassa, and into the very heart of North Africa. This demand came in time to be met in the introduction of a slightly larger East African cowries. An experimental introduction to Ouida of the Andalus cowries from the East African coast was attempted by Hamburg-based traders in 1845. You remember earlier that I said one cowrie is earlier, the other comes late. So in 1550, they're dealing with the Monte, and then the Andalus comes later on, years later. All right, both of those are Indo-Pacific origin. So we should be cool there. Now, experimental introduction of Ouida, the Andalus cowrie from East Africa, was attempted to Hamburg-based traders in 1845 and proved acceptable to local palm oil traders. By the 1890s, suggested Hajadorn and Johnson, most of the cowries used in Togo and in the Yoruba country were the Analus species. So in the later periods, according to Lovejoy and other sources, the Analus gets introduced into the the later that early and late part of that 19th century, and now you have the Analus in the areas. All right, so some areas refused them. One trader west of the Volta recalled a shipment being thrown into the sea, and in the Igbo country east of the Niger, apart from the town of Onitsha, what is that? On, Onitsha, yeah, itself. These larger cowries apparently never penetrated. So now you get traders rejecting these cowrie shells, and they're dumping the cowrie shells. All right. Ogundara was the author I was reading from. Got you. Yeah, yeah. That's in your Yoruba book, right, Ben? That's in the book you was recommending us. All right. Okay. So we're on par. Okay. So by the let me get into this. So the idea of introduction, I had to fix my mic. The idea of introduction of the Analus in 1845 is, of course, too neat. It seems that the Atlantic shipments had often been mixed. You had Barbot in 1682 described a lot of the Aleda that consisted on different size cowries, although the large ones were admittedly a minority. By the early 18th century, any large cowries were recognized as being lower in value than the smaller sort. For the example, the Dutch are known to have been importing cowries from Mozambique in the second part of the 18th century at half the value of the smaller cowries reported to come from Maldives. Now, the Analus is also present in small numbers as assemblages that were likely sourced in the Maldives and were clearly associated with the trans-Saharan trade routes. Now, for instance, the cowrie load from the 11th, 12th century abandoned caravan load of Medine Ijafin, also known as the Blad al-Wadu, the place of the cowries, lying in an isolated tract of the Mauritanian Sahara contained with the Analus and other Indo-Pacific cowries among the much more numerous Monte. Useful though they certainly are, historical sources can nonetheless be quite unreliable of essential facts. For example, the assumption informed by the uncritical acceptance of the writings of North African and Middle Eastern observers that cowries were introduced into West Africa as part of an expansion of Islamic trans-Saharan trade routes is challenged by the archaeological site of Kissi in northern Burkina Faso, where deposits were dated from the 15th to 17th century AD. Despite likely predating trans-Saharan Islamic networks, these funerary contexts yielded 6 cowries, all Monte, associated with the material culture, including brass jewelry, weapons, and glass beads. These shells had been modified and are thought to have been attached. You can see here, thought to have been attached to the rim of a headpiece. All right, so let's look at it here. This is what's in dispute right now. To resemble a headpiece, they look like they could resemble a headpiece. All right, everybody cool? All right, we got it. Now, similarly, the Kano Chronicle assertion that cowries only reached that city, and by the extension, the wider Hausa in the 18th century, is wrong. Cowries occur archaeologically much earlier, notably at Derby, Takushi, near Katsina in the 14th and 15th centuries, and at Malay near Sokoto in possible 16th century context. Additionally, over reviews of the spread of cowries in West Africa generally applied principles of formal economic anthropology, which a rather narrow time depth and little consideration of social creation of value. The work of Hajadorn and Johnson and Carl Paligny who popularized cowries as a primitive currency in pre-colonial Dahomey, involving central issues and regulated importation, are examples of this. However, while economic history has often considered the uncertainties in long-distance trade as logistical and symptomatic in pre-modern conditions, recent currents in economic anthropology have pointed out the importance of studying people and their behavior, as well as the rules of the markets. In recognition of this study, our study of cowries in West Africa has been framed around the consideration of how past West African communities procured, valued, and modified these shells. Checking the chat. All right. So here you go. Examining the archaeological story methodology. So they're giving us what they did. Our first-hand assessment of 4,559 cowries from 78 sites involved visual microscopic assessment to record conditions, species, and size of any evidence of anthropogenic modification. Sample size and many assemblages were assessed, particularly for early periods. It's small, representing 5 or fewer shells. Species. Shell species was determined based on both dorsal and vitral shell morphology. All right. Cowries that could not be identified to species were recorded as cypre, something we see common. We see this name commonly used. So if they were unknown, they marked them as cypre. So they looked at the size. So you're looking at the length, the width, and where possible heights of the shells were measured using digital calipers. In the subsequent analysis, in order to enable a comparative approach, shells were grouped into 4 size categories. These were extra smalls, which were length less than 10 millimeters small, or 10 to 15 millimeters medium, 15 to 20 millimeters and large, anything greater than 20. All right. We developed these categories during our work on the 3,433 shells from Medine and Jafin. Largely assemblages, because remember, the 34, 33, you're talking about Mauritania at this particular time when they're dealing with those shell differences. Large assemblages allow us to study size distributions reliable with the Medine Etchefin. Is very unusual in its scale, but we complemented it with a study of shells from natural history collections. This allowed us to identify significant patterns. The Maldivian ecological and archaeological assemblages of both the Annalus and Monte tend to include a higher proportion of small and medium shells, whereas the East African archaeological and ecological assemblages of both species featured a higher proportion of medium and large shells. Importantly, the differences in sizes of the Maldivian and East African origin remain apparent even when Annalus and Monte are combined. This is a significant. In methodological terms, many archaeological sites only yield small assemblages of cowrie shells and may include a mixture of Annalus and Monte. The fact that the shell size is indicative in provenance regardless of species allow us to combine data from both species and thus opens a greater number of sites. I'm not going to take you through all 36 pages of this particular article. It is very important to understand how these people did what they did and why they did what they did. And I'm going to hit us with the summary, the conclusion of this, because we need to know what it is as pertaining to what's been uncovered in this particular study. So far, we know out of 4,500 shells, they focused on 2 specific, which were used for trade and currencies in West Africa. These 2 were the Annalus and the Monte. They come from Indo-Pacific areas. We know one entered in West Africa, 1515 in Benin specifically, dealing with trade. So we know we're looking at between the 10th and the 11th, we start seeing these shells, but more modernly around that, in the 1500s. So within the wider literature, information and modification techniques and guidance for the analysis of use were where on cowrie shells are surprisingly limited. York, following his study of the cowries from Ghanaian assemblages, proposed 3 methods of modification: grinding, chipping, and piercing. Ground cowries were observed to have a flat, smooth surface, whereas chip cowries featured a more rugged hole. Piercings was not used to remove the dorsum, but rather to create a small hole at one or both ends. York also suggested that backing tend to be restricted to Monte specimens with, hold up, with also suggesting the backing tended to restrict the Monte specimens with the majority of Annalus and native West African cowries. Right? Remember, they're only giving West Africa courtesy of 4 cowries. All right. Now, and they named those 4, right? We saw those in the oceanic reviews earlier on. And then we know about the other, the imports, which we're dealing with the Annalus and the Monte. We know they were used for decorations, headgear, divinations, all of that. We're gonna get into, a lot of that stuff right there. So Francis in 1987 conducted experimental work to investigate shell bead manufacturer. He supposed that the most efficient means by which to remove cowrie dorsums was to combine hammering and grinding with a basalt stone. This could be seen to be a combination of chipping and grinding methods proposed by York. And we ain't talking about the one that's locked up. Most recently, Heath classified cowries from the 19th century deposits from Seklo in the Obame region, now Republic of the Mean, into 3 categories potentially reflecting different modification processes. You got cell group 1, which characterized by a large rugged dorsal hole, which is what Heath suggests could have been created by chipping. 2, on the other hand, comprised by shells in a smoother, straight, and smaller dorsal hole that Heath attributes to the shell have been grounded. Shells in the final category, group 3, feature the straight or smooth dorsal hole with a keyhole shape. This could be attributed to a particular process. Our own research has identified at least 4 modification processes suggesting a greater diversity in perforation technique and distribution than hitherto supposed. I ain't gonna get into the patterns because we got to remember a lot of those that didn't have the particular pattern were listed as Supre and gone from there. Let me get there because I got a lot of shell talk. This article sets the stage for what I'm said earlier. Okay. So I'm gonna get into this little conclusion, and as you can see, it's not long, it's little. And then we're gonna get into some other our next shell talk. Man, come on, like the show, share the show, tell a friend, tell a friend. We're talking about cowrie shell specifically, cowrie shell origins, and its significance. So our discussion is drawn on a range. Oh, my bad. That should be good on y'all cell phone eyes. All right. Our discussion is drawn on a range of sites from West Africa. The picture is necessarily only partial, dictated by the availability of assemblages for us today to study. Moreover, particularly from the early periods, sample sizes in many assemblages are small. It may be the shells from early periods are less well preserved, perhaps fragmented, and therefore more difficult to identify as cowries, or that such shells had greater value and were therefore scarcer, curated longer, or less likely to have been deposited. Indeed, it is noteworthy that many of the cowrie assemblages from earlier period sites come from caches or grave contexts. The general picture is that the results obtained from our study of cowries seem to have support the narrative proposed in historical and ethnographic sources. The ecological data on habitat preferences in the 2 key Indo-Pacific species confirm that while both have a wide geographical spread, Monetaria Monte dominates the Maldives and Monetaria Annalus on the East African coast. So the Monte Annalus is more related to the East African coast. This is Indo-Pacific shell. Both of them are, but the Monte has more of a geographical widespread, but the Annalus designatedly resembles that. So when they're talking about Egypt and the fascination with cowrie shells, the decorations and things of that nature, you should know that they're talking about the Annalise shell, right? And then the Monte would be more so a more celebrated or a more trajectory shell. Well, it's projection, not trajectory, but projection would be wider and used for other areas. So, however, concluding from this that archaeological unequivocally supports historical driven models would be hasty. The archaeological data are patchy, and differing trajectories of research in various parts of West Africa make comparisons challenging. While Panansky and McIntosh once warned that archaeology of Sahelian regions was marred by an overemphasis of historical sources, years later, Chowan estimated that Sahelian archaeology has succeeded in establishing a discourse of history of human occupation, and that the wooded savanna areas now lag behind. So one result of direct impact in savanna areas now impacting on our study of cowries has been a poor chronological parity in assemblages, with the earlier sites largely lying inland, while sites of later date are mainly on the coast. We have advanced the idea that shell size can be used as a means of provenancing shells, but this should be seen within the context of certain limitations. Size is a more effective criterion for larger assemblages. In an ideal world, we should dispose of assemblages that include a sufficient number of shells, perhaps 100, so that hypothesis can be credible. In practice, however, given the small size of most assemblages recovered archaeology, man, what's going on with me? Archaeologically, it may be necessary to settle for 25 or even, as in the case of present paper tin shells. Further work will determine whether isotopic markers might be used for provenancing. Now, in an immediate, however, comparative analysis relies on consistent data collection by viewing shells as a collective regional and, to a lesser extent, chronological trends in species selections and modifications can be sought out. On the risk in cowrie shells in archaeological reconstructions is a tendency to clarity in arguments. Not unreasonably, cowries are taken as evidence of long distant connection, but using these shells to uphold chronological assessments is unwarranted. For example, inferring from the presence of Annalise that a site is late in date and must have had Atlantic trade connections is problematic. I want to say this line again because there is a person that is making a claim that is problematic. And here's the suggestion of that claim. For an example, and I'm glad that my Mac kind of highlighted it in blue. All right. For example, inferring from the presence of Annalise that at the site is late in date and must have had Atlantic trade connections is problematic. Annalise may well occur more commonly naturally in East Africa. But these shells also lived in Maldives and were part of shipments of shells coming in through trans-Saharan trade networks. Equally, Maldivian shells were shipped through Atlantic trade networks over centuries, and and quite how far they may have traveled inland remains an open question. Essentially, cowrie shells should be considered in conjunction with other material culture. They should not be used as a single strand of evidence for connections of chronology. Trade systems were complex, with various goods likely traveling along different networks, and to occurrence of shells with other items of material culture will be important factors. It may be an obvious statement, but things, be they cowries or anything else, never traveled without human agency. Choices were made about which type of shell was acceptable or desirable. Moreover, the question of the use of native West African species requires further work. Ethnographic evidence suggests that they, like imported Monte and Annalise shells, were used in a variety of socially complex situations. So I just want to hit everybody upside the head with the opening argument here regarding the shell discussion that may take place especially by a PhD who may be trying to link or make a connection to the Atlantic, which would be problematic. I also wanted to hint on this because if you think about the slave trade, or just if you think about trade in general, it ain't got to necessarily be, oh, I'm not done, Ben. We just getting started. If you think about the earlier onset of trade, what did the European do to diminish the value of the goods and services that West Africans had in its earlier onset? They went elsewhere and brought in items from these other places and labeled them basically exotic. It could be similar, but not the same. It could be similar in what it is. So for instance, if the four main cowrie shells that developed on the coastlines of West Africa was what was used as commerce, they would import or they would bring in these Annalise and Monte shells from the Indo-Pacific area or the Mediterranean somewhere that would be foreign to West Africans. And as the trade developed between the Europeans and the natives on the coastlines, right? They no longer they wouldn't need those spices. They wouldn't need their shells. They wouldn't need anything. They'll just come to West Africa with new spices, new shells, and other things. This is the behavior of that. So, this influence would then set the bar for pretty much in my eyes. I'm hypothesizing right here, would set the bar in my eyes based on what we know about how the Europeans conducted trade in West Africa and manipulating Africans, especially in the value of certain things for gold. If they were going to trade shells for gold, these imported Annalise and Monte cowrie shells would have more of a significant importance because they seemed exotic and gold was of abundance to a lot of West Africans. So in trade for that and other natural resources, you can get beat. But let's continue. So that is the projected position there. Hold on one second. Let me plug my laptop. All right. Okay, so now we cooking. We now know that there were four main cowrie shells in West Africa at this time and the areas where they come from. We have the study that says that. Then we also know that there were two imported cowrie shells that were foreign, whether the Muslims brought them in the area or whether the Europeans come later with them in 1515 in some places and start setting up shop with these new shells. We have archaeological information here. And of course, I provided you with the sources already in the description of this video. So let's move forward. So let's get into cowrie shell artifact from Bolsa Chica, an example of prehistoric exchange. Now, I don't want to do this one yet. I'm going to come back to this one. Because this is going to deal with, as you can see, the Pacific here, and we talking California. I don't want to deal with this one yet. So let's get into tracking the cowries excavations of Maldives. Let's build a little bit more on the Maldives, but not getting too specific. Let me see if y'all can see this. Should be able to see this pretty good. Let me back out the 175 then. All right. This is going to mimic a lot of what we basically just read or pulled from the initial onset, but this is an inclusive source, right? This is an inclusive source from the original source that we used in the argument. For an example, you're going to see some of the same familiar names, but this is Hoare and Christie and Jafar's work that was implemented in the previous source that I gave you guys. All right. So I'm gonna read this introduction here, and just so you know what I'm talking about. So this note reports an archaeological fieldwork undertaken in 2016 in the Maldives, archipelago. I don't know how to say a word. Archipelago involving excavations at 3 sites of the wider surveys. The aim was to identify sites likely to date to this medieval Islamic period as part of a research project investigating the timescale and nature of the importation of cowrie shells to prey into West Africa, 1150 to 1900 AD. Same time frame. Now, the Maldives are often assumed to have been a main source of these shells. This has never been archaeologically tested. Now, from the 9th century onwards, sporadic mentions were made of these islands, their trade links, and the importance of cowries. Such allusions were made by the Arab authors such as al-Bukhari and Ibn Battuti. All right. Now I can get into Coswell. I get that. Now, many incidentally also describe in West Africa. But apart from the survey, pottery unearthed in Maldivian capital Malé, no archaeological work had ever investigated the Islamic period. So this is the importance of the corpus of early Arabic sources for West African history. This is why you see Levitzian and Hopkins show up here, right? It says the importance of cowries in West Africa past is well known. They are inevitably mentioned as markers of Africa's global connections. All right, and their role within the West African social fabric suggests a deep history. Cowries in West Africa are first mentioned in the mid-10th century as ornaments in women's hair, and that's Levitzian and Hopkins. In the 11th century, Al-Bukhari states that cowries are among the most sought-after commodities in Kagul, right? These are all the things that we just read about. Similarly, an early capital of the Songhai Empire in present-day Mali or Niger. By the 14th century, cowries are described as currency, the evolution of the cowrie. All right, fabrics, hair ornaments, currency, and an import on which vast profits were made. Now, Al-Umari in Hopkins, and he says that in Hopkins' book. Now, in the 14th century, Battuti saw 1150 cowries sold for 1 gold denier. You remember when I told y'all earlier, right? You can say I was cheating, but you remember when I told y'all earlier that how they did trade, and I just mentioned gold and throughout that. There you go. In 14th century, Battuti saw 1150 cowries sold for 1 gold denier in Mali. Simon Lucas, in the late 18th century, explicitly writes that sub-Saharan consumers value cowries for both ritual and currency usage. Oral traditions today evidence the centrality of cowries to West African stock, while archaeology confirms the antiquity of cowrie usage. They are routinely recovered, some well-known instances being first millennium necropolis of Kissi, Burkina Faso, a 10th century burial at Akumbi, Mali, the 11th century lost caravan from the Mauritania Sahara, the mound of the Yohogu in the Atakwar mountains of Benin, and the 16th century site of Dubir in Nigeria. It says, although the cowries occur throughout the Indo-Pacific, I'm telling y'all, this is key. It is the Maldives specifically which been described as main exporters of these shells, and we wanted to discover whether this was likely to be accurate. So they set out to do their work to see. Now, this is not Inyame Akuma. This is an African doing this work. So Through the Coweries, they sketched a compelling picture of daily life in Asia, Europe, and Africa, and the succession of merchant groups who brought the shells to West Africa. This is the only detailed synthesis of the topic, but useful as it is, it remains concerned with the fluctuations in currency rates following global markets and gives little in-depth information on local constructions of values. There's your source again, Ben. But because of the pre-industrial societies, the value of medium of exchange may be intricately linked to social, political, and spiritual significance. This economic approach to cowries can only give a very partial story. Finally, most problematic beyond often cited medieval sources, Hargeron and Johnson's book gives little insight into the longer time scale for cowries and usage in West Africa. So, not to go over some already work that we did, but this is going to be more specific with the Maldives. They break this down eloquently in a 14-page article. They give us their usage and where we deal with what we want to deal with. All right. So I have this in the description of the video. For those of you who are getting ready to partake in a conversation potentially, or entertain the thought processes of a conversation of someone linking cowrie shells all across Africa and into the New World, you can go back to the actual work that has been done on the subject matter, and you can gain some understanding and recognizing the flaws in one's methodology to come to a conclusion in which they did or as they project out. We're going to force them to be very careful in their assertions in the coming months, especially if they want to say that Africans was in West and Central Africans was in the New Worlds and was on the islands and all of that stuff. All right, craziness. But anyway, and they're using shells in some of their arguments. So I wanted to drop this on y'all and not to just kind of bore you in this particular area, but we just read a little bit of the intro. So now you know what you're up against and why the excavations in 2016 is significant in the conversation. So you also have, right? Come on, man. What you thought I was playing? I know I'm in here. Oh, my bad. I thought I had my read up already. But I also had the journals from JSTOR. Again, 30 pages. Give you that work. Links in the description. And this is talking about basically the cowrie shells, global trade, and local exchange piercings together the evidence to colonial Virginia. This is going to take you back to the two cowries that we just read about that are Indo-Pacific. You can see them here, or you can't see them. But now you probably can see them now. But this is going to take you to pretty much where we began at. Cowries of the species of Monte and Annalus are marine gastropods native to the Indo-Pacific Ocean. Both species served historically as currency in West Africa. Archaeologists have interpreted cowries at a North American historical site as evidence of African or African American identity and spirituality. Economic historians studying colonial economic systems do not consider cowries in North America at all. The temporal and spatial distribution of these shells in Virginia suggested their use is in the 18th century colony merits critical examination. Cowries were concentrated in colonial ports that served as transatlantic slave trade. Shells may have been used subsequently in the colony as currency in an economy characterized by a chronic shortage of coin. A regional analytical scale reveals a more complex picture of the temporal, spatial, and social distribution of cowries than has been understood to date, underscoring the roles that cowries played in a local and regional response to colonialism.
We're going to make them tread lightly. I don't care if you have a PhD. I don't care if you're on the biggest platform on YouTube. You're going to tread lightly. I don't care if you got some people that I look up to on there helping you in your argument, not necessarily helping you in your argument, but supporting your work. So, in the introduction, and I'm not going to give you too much of this, the cowrie shells of Monteria genus dating back to the 17th and 20th centuries have been found on archaeological sites from Canada to Caribbean to Brazil. Now, while some cowries found in the northeastern and upper Midwest of North America are associated with American Indians, right? Much of the discussion relating to the shells has focused on their use by African diasporic communities. So archaeologists and other historical oriented scholars have largely inferred meaning from samples of cowries collecting from single sites, site loci, or individual features. Studies conducted at this scale focus on the cultural practices and beliefs of enslaved Africans and their descendants, exploring historical connections between cowrie use in the old world, where it was widespread in West and Central Africa, and New World actions. Archaeologists have interpreted cowries as among the few objects that enslaved people were able to carry with them from Africa, most likely in small numbers worn on their bodies. Their presence at quarter sites has been as indicative of survival of generalized African traditions, or the creations of African American identities through the use of adornment, divination, and practices associated with its well being. All right, so more recent research has considered the social and symbolic roles of cowries. Now, Ogundaran explores the mechanisms of cowrie distributions among the Yoruba and the processes through which people reinterpreted and redeployed Indo-Pacific shells within their cultural traditions as, central to the everyday rituals of self-realization. Tene Adrande Lima and her colleagues have interpreted an assemblage of cowries recovered from Valongo Wharf in Rio de Janeiro as part of a larger group of objects used by enslaved people, including beads, crystals, figures, bracelets, rings to create a second skin for physical and spiritual protection. Americanists Archaeologists also recognize the use of cowries as currency in Africa, but few have considered implications of the use of diasporic context. Lord Pierce argues that cowries might have been used as trade tokens with plantation settings, saved by European travelers as examples of unusual foreign money, or carried as a ballast and dumped overboard by slave traders leaving American shores for Europe, while Bianco de Course and Housen suggests that in New York, African seafarers carried in exchange small numbers of shells they had acquired while trading in the Old World. Despite the widespread interest in cowries on North American sites, no systemic research has been brought to bear on questions relating to their arrival and distribution, nor have previous archaeological studies investigated whether Africans and their descendants were the only users of cowries in the southern colonies and Caribbean. The answer to each of these questions will contribute to an expanding understanding of their use and significance. So the work of the historians considering the distribution of sale commodities, their global approach pays scant attention to the appearance of the use of cowries in the Western Hemisphere on the basis that cowries were not monetized, and that the vast majority of the shells in circulation within the Atlantic world never reached the West. Both archaeological and historical studies are valuable. Cowries were central to the lives of many Africans and important symbolically in the New World. An understanding of the global market of the Indo-Pacific shells provides import sites into the scope and complexity of colonial trade networks necessary for the operation of transatlantic slave trade. However, a regional scale of analysis that charts of the middle ground between site-specific and global approaches expands the narrow lens through which most archaeological studies of cowries in the New World have been the focus. So they drew upon 353 shells from 55 sites. Sound familiar? Except for you had a more wider range when dealing with Mauritanian and West African sites. All right. So in Virginia, the regional analytical scale used here provides a more fine-grained understanding of the interplay between international, regional, and local systems of trade and exchange. It highlights colonial strategies for negotiating economic constraints imposed by the British Empire. The study summarizes new evidence for the bulk transportation of cowries to the mainland North America and the Caribbean via the transatlantic slave trade, and interprets these findings to suggest the use of cowries as a currency in colonial Virginia during the first 3 quarters of the 18th century. So these um, shells they get here in the 18th century via the slave trade. So if someone tells you that they were trading and these Africans was in the New World with these currencies trading, the argument is over. The argument is over. Don't argue with these people. Do not listen to these people. I don't care what they write. I don't care what they say. I don't care what platform they are on. If they are going to use cowrie shells and try to link them to the New World to say that Africans was doing trade in the Caribbeans, in Canada, and in the US of A, they are lying out of their a-holes. I don't care if they got PhDs. I do not care. These shells don't get here until the 18th century via the slave trade. Judy said, thanks for the heads up. Okay, cool. No problem, bro. No problem. So I wanted to give you these things before it gets out of hand. Because I'm not really paying attention to the conversation, but I'm hearing things. And this whole diffusion of cowries in the Egyptian culture in Africa. So I would, draw. Hopefully, you would draw upon MDW Jeffrey's work and deal with the diffusion of Babylonian culture can be traced even to the United States, because I think where some of this energy is coming from could be something like this. I don't know what y'all been paying attention. I'm just saying, I'm just doing my little, I'm just doing me. You know what I'm saying? So let me put this on the screen real quick. So let's see. Could our PhD counterparts be using this as an argument? The diffusion of Babylonian culture can be traced even to the United States. Thus, another increment of civilization due to the Babylonians is a series of metric standardizations. These included divisions of the circle into 360 degrees on the day of the 24th, originally 12 hours, of the hour into the 16th minute, the 60th minutes of the foot of the 12 inches in the pound, as it survives in our troy weight, into 12 ounces. It is apparent that the system involved in these measures is based on the number of 12 and its multiple 60. The weights current in the ancient Near East also increased by 60s. On these weights were based the ancient money values. The Greek mina, the Hebrew maneh, the approximately a pound, comprised 60 shekels, and 60 minas made a talent. It is only a short time ago that in the South Germany 60 cruisers still made a golden. This system, the Greeks derived from the Asian Minor and Phoenicia. Their borrowing of the names as well as the close correspondence of the actual weight of the units evidence their origin in Babylonia or adjacent Armenia. The Dewey Decimal method of reckoning was carried west, became deeply ingrained during the Roman Empire, and carried down through the Middle Ages to the modern time. Certain of these metric units became fixed more than 2,000 years ago and have descended to us by an unbroken tradition. The Babylonian degrees, minutes, and seconds became an integral part of the ancient astronomy, were taken on by the Greeks, incorporated by them in their development of the system of astronomy known as the Ptolemaic, and thus became a part of Roman, Arab, and medieval Europeans' science. No one boggles into this diffusion or of an aspect of Babylonian culture. The point to note is that when things are measured, not counted, a Dewey Decimal Notation is used. I will now turn to a corresponding diffusion of culture in Africa. Professor Hershkovich, in his article on the culture areas of Africa, refers to the ninth or last division, the Valley of the Nile, in the following words. The influence of this area on the remaining culture areas of Africa must have been profound. Just what these influences may have been constitutes one of the most interesting problems presented to an Africanist. Much the same opinion is held by another student in the first longhand knowledge of the southern Saharan region. Sir Richard Palmer writes, the Sudan, in fact, has preserved, though often doubtless in an attenuated form, much that once belonged to the ancient world, for it contains the living cultural, residuum of a very much that once was characteristic of Babylonian or Neve, Ophir, Tarshish, or Punt, Egypt, or Carthage. The culture found in the Sudan, anywhere westward and south to penetrate into the rainforest of littoral. Strong traces of some of its culture can still be found in the Umandri branch of the Igbo. This branch claims connection with the Igala and the Jukun of the Upper Benue. In this article, I propose to offer evidence of the influence of Egyptian trade and the use of the cowrie shell as a medium of exchange. The cowrie ranges in West Africa from the Sahara of the Gulf of the Benin, taking the whole of the basin of the Niger Benue, and including also Upper Congo, Lualaba area. Its economic sphere centers in Timbuktu and the country around Lake Chad. So in 1930, on the instructions of the Nigerian government, I was sent to investigate the magico-religious beliefs of the Igbo in the Akwa division. One of the administration areas of the Onitsha province was the headquarters in Onitsha on the left bank of the Niger. In many places, I found that the cowrie shell was still the local currency. The cowrie shell is not a native of the Atlantic Ocean. There are two varieties, one called the Mbandambu by the Igbo. It was practically seized to be used as currency. It was not the original Igbo currency cowrie. Its distribution along the seacoast and along the main waters of the Niger suggests that its use was due to importation by Europeans. Thus, cowries are shells brought to the Europe from the Maldives Islands in the East Indies and are always in great demand at Ouida, Ardo, and Lagos, at which places they are not only the medium of exchange, but from whence they are also sent to Dahomey, Hejo, Hausa, and Jabu, and into the heart of the North Africa, where it is known they are the circulating currency. The second variety, called the Igbo Ayolo, is still the one in use and is the type used in currency over much of Nigeria. It is the Cypre Monte, found only in the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean. Cowries serve as the medium of exchange in Dahomey. These have been introduced from the Far East, the shellfish from which they are made not being found on the West Coast, so that they were tiresome, met them under the name of margarites. At Benin wonders how they had already arrived there. Though margarites elsewhere stand on the cowries, it might also be argued that here at the Benin, they referred to glass beads, so that it was necessary to establish the occurrence and the use of cowries in West Africa before the arrival of Europeans. Jean Barbault, on the Gold Coast, writes as follows. About the year 1480, the Spanish trading at the coast found these blacks extremely covetous and found of a sort of seashell. Cromasto, an early Italian traveler, wrote in 1455, in this district, the Songhai Kingdom, no money is coined, nor do they use money any more than in the neighboring countries, but all their trade is carried on by bartering one thing for another. While in their towns within land, they use little white shells, which are brought to Venice from the Levant, of which they pay certain numbers according to the goodness of what they want to buy. Earlier than Catamosto, in the testimony of the great Arabian traveler Batuta, he mentions that the cowrie was used in currency in African kingdom in Mel in 1352, which he's saying Mali, okay? In 1352, and adds that he had seen cowrie shells similarly used in the Maldives Islands. Discussing this cowrie currency, Mr. Gibbs writes, the existence of a cowrie exchange in Mali Empire alongside a salt exchange is conclusive of the commercial relations across African continent referred to in its note 14. As cowries are found in Africa only on the east coast between the equator and Mozambique. In Batuti's time, however, cowries were imported by merchants from the north. Also, the Reverend J.J. Williams, speaking of the Fulani, he says they provided for themselves in the matter of currency with cowries or shells of Maldives, which originally came to them by the caravans of Egypt. Both Catamosto Batuti give the lie to the following statement in the Kano Chronicles of Northern Nigeria. In Sharif's time, 1703 to 1731, cowries first came to Hassaland. It is thus clear that the cowrie shell used as currency in the African kingdom of Mali and Songhai did not owe its origin to European influence. Elsewhere, native tradition gives greater antiquity than these historical records for those of the cowrie shells. Among the Iwe is the story that the cowries were found in a basket sent from heaven by Mawa, God, and used for the trade. Among the Yoruba is a tradition surrounding the death of Oduduwa, the founder of the nation. On his death, the Oba of Benin inherited all of Oduwa's money, cowries. There is sufficient evidence marshaled here to show that the use of the cowrie shell as money in West Africa long antedated the arrival of the Europeans. This shell, whose origin in the Red Sea and Indian Ocean, when found at Benin in 1480, must have spread from east to west. From the Igbo to the Ayola, the Cipre Monte is said to have been the currency used by the Ndeshi or titled ancestors, and was thus the one with which they were first acquainted. Here's an interesting discovery made. The Igbo, when counting mice and men, pots and pans, and so forth, used a decimal notation such as we use. But when thus counting cowries as notations based on Dewey Decimal System was used, thus you have the following: 1 unit, 2 unit, blah, 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 blah. Asiago, Nabo, Neto, Nano, Nese, Nesi, Nasa, Nasato, Tegeti, Nele, Manu, Mabu, Mato, Mano, Misi, Masa, Masato, Mataheti, Ozu, Egu, Ugu, Ego, Nata, Ozu, I sound like Ben, don't I? Ozu, Ugu, Afia, Nabu, Ozu, Afia, Nenu, Afia, Nabu, Ozu, Nenu, Afia, Nenu, Afia, Nenu. Yeah, get my language on over here. But anyway, so that's pretty much how they label their decimal system. And as you can see, the numbers are going up and down. So a few comments on the above two systems will bring out certain points that would not otherwise be noticed. Some difficulty is often experienced in ascertaining native methods of counting. For it may be found that there is no set nomenclature, and that though no mistakes are made in actual counting, yet the native wording may vary widely in different individuals. Thus, in English, the number 600 has a definite form, 600, but a native may express this total in several different ways, all correct. IE as 50 in 12 places, as 60 in 10 places, as 100 in 6 places. He will state that all these methods of computing are understood and no way is better than another, and he will be correct. So again, if they count in the grasp of 60s, they will take, if it's they would look as 50 in 12 places. So they will get to 50 in 12 places, right? How do you get to 50 in 12 places? 5 times 12. So they will put 5, 5, 5, 5, 5, 5, 5, all the way till they get to 60. And if they got 60, then they will do it in 10 places. So you have 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60. All right, everybody got that? Okay, 10 places. All right, cool. We good. All right. Anyway, but that's how they get to the number that they're trying to get to. All right, now investigating into the Cowerie counting system soon showed that there was no capriciousness in the counting, but that a definite nomenclature existed within keywords for key numbers, and that these keywords appeared in an ordered sequence to expressing high numbers. Thus, you get the following. Isi igu, igu nabu, igu nele. Yeah, Judy laughing at the exit. Yeah, man, come on now. Ozu ugu, ugu neto, ugu nele, neli, osu ugu. I'm getting it, man. It's got to come from the spirit. Now, in the Igbo system of counting, the key words peculiar to it are igu, ugu, and afia. And they are all multiples of 6 or 60. These are possibly one more key word in nu, but it appears to have taken over from the decimal notation. Its use is, however, and normally for its two values. In the decimal notation, it stands for 400 and is thus connected with the root unu or enu, which equals 4. In the Cowerie notation, enu stands for 200. These observations refer to the Umandri or divine king group of the Igbo. Of the Igbo. There are other Igbo tribes whose counting systems show variations according as things of cowries are counted. Thus, traces of the unit 6 are found among the Igbo or the Owiri or the Okijiwi districts. Now, I can get some corrections on them. Whereas the decimal notation is that already recorded. Now, the above investigation has established the fact that the Igbo formerly used two systems of counting. Why? What was the advantage of two? Now, is it clear? What is the answer? Is there's no advantage? Then did the Igbo evolve from himself two systems? Highly unlikely. It's also to be noted that the sextuple system is linked only with cowrie, an exotic object. As cowries were used extensively in Africa, an examination of cowrie counting systems elsewhere becomes imperative to see whether the Igbo system is unique or whether being an exotic material object, the cowrie brought its exotic counting system with it. I have been able to collect a little evidence tabulated here, though, too. So here we have the Yoruba, the Sobo, the Igbo, the Hausa. And then you have how they count one cowrie, one man, 20 cowries, 20 man, 60 cowries, 60 man. And we got Ben in the chat who could correct this. Is this Okuu or Okuu for one cowrie? Ini or is that Ani? Because you know they ain't got no diacritics. Okuu, Ogan, Ugoto, Ugota. It's pretty much the same. Igbo, Pointer, and Yoruba. All right, now this table shows that in these tribes, I have not seen the table any more evidence that cowries has a system of enumeration different from the enumeration in general. Can these systems based on 6 and 60, like that is English, be linked to the Babylonian? Dr. Mink hints at its possibility. With regard to the possible influences from other directions, the existence of the Dewey Decimal System enumeration may point to an early connection with Babylonian or Sumerian people. It seems far-fetched where Africa, and especially West Africa, is concerned. A much nearer source would be Egypt is available. Are y'all picking up on this? They're trying to hint at someone else teaching West Africans this particular system, which they are enshrining comes from the Babylonian and Sumerian people. So you're getting ready to see the confusion coming here if you're going to take that particular lane or that particular path. Now, the earliest numeral systems, that of the ancient Egypt, shows a combined use of a sexagesimal and a decimal system, a position paralleled among the Igbo. In Egypt, the division of the years of the Dewey Decimal System, which has survived in reckoning of the months 12 and decades 36 and the hours of the day and the night 12, arithmetic was on the decimal system. When goods were weighed in ancient Egypt, a system based on 6 was used. The Alexandrine talent, which was used for wood, contained 360 utens. And this talent of the 360 utens, when we could see the influence of sexagesimal system in Asia Minor, which was really a commercial standard of comparatively late development and never at the time employed the precious metals. The Alexandrian talent of 360 utiens contained 360 cats. Thus, a sexagesimal system was in the use in ancient Egypt, especially for measurements. It is possible, therefore, that 6 cowrie shells may have been a measure of unit. Marco Polo, speaking of cowries in China, remarks that they were from the standard of measure by weight. 80 of those porcelain shells passed for a single weight for a silver. This use of the cowrie shell elsewhere throws light on its use in Nigeria. Although Egypt has provided almost the earliest evidence of the cultural use of the money, cowrie shells never played any prominent part in the lower Nile Valley. The Indians who traded with Egypt used the cowrie for money. The Chinese, who also traded with Egypt at a very remote period, used tortoise, probably cowrie shells, for money. This system dates as far back as the 28th century BC. When it is realized that almost the only positive records of maritime achievement before 2000 BC relate to the Egyptians, it seems that when it is reported that India and China were trading with Egypt, it is really Egypt that was trading with the two lands, carrying cowrie shells across the Erythraean Sea, with which the Egyptian mariners were very familiar. Once the cowrie was established as a means of foreign currency, it would not be long before the Egyptians would introduce it to Africa, and with it their own system of reckoning by sixes. To clinch the argument that the cowrie notation has been diffused from ancient Egypt, let us see what are accepted canons of diffusion. So Professor Goldenweiser writes, the hypothesis of diffusion is more favorable situated than of the independent origin. Diffusion can often be demonstrated not so independent origin. We say that a feature, object, or idea develop independently in a given tribe. This is a negative proposition scarcely amenable of proof. To furnish such, we should be able to put the finger on the feature of the very time and place of its origin. In addition to being fully conversant with the cultural anecdotes within the tribe, a condition too unlikely for serious consideration. On the other hand, when we say the diffusion is demonstrable, we do not mean that it can be demonstrated in every case. In the absence of historic evidence, which alone can be furnished, conclusive demonstration diffusion must be balanced against independent and development in the scales of probability. The geographical factor must be taken into account. In the absence of historic evidence and all else being equal, proximity, ease of communication of knowledge of its actuality favor diffusion. Certainty of diffusion is established by historical evidence, and clear historical evidence is available to show the diffusion into American and Babylonian culture and the use of certain measurements. But historical evidence is lacking. Circumstantial evidence can be determined the diffusion of a culture. Among the Igbo, most of the historical evidence is lacking. There is historical evidence to show commercial context across Africa. The cowrie shell is in use comes from east coast of Africa and so fits in the historical evidence. In many tribes, where the cowrie is used as monetary systems, a special form of notation is employed. And in many instances, this notation is based on a unit involving six, either as a duodecimal or a sexagesimal notation. This type of notation is also found in ancient Egypt, which traded on the east coast of Africa as well as across the continent. So that one has an exotic, the theory linked to a special hold up, linked to a special notation. It is so highly unlikely that in a number of the tribes using cowrie currencies, there should first of all be a special notation used for counting cowries only. And secondly, that in each instance, the special notation should be on a basis units of six. All right. Now, Egypt, where such a notation is known to have existed, and the east coast of the Red Sea and of Africa are accessible from Igbo land by foot. Circumstantial evidence leaves no alternative but to accept diffusion of the cowrie and its notation from Egypt. So Professor Lowry lays down the following rules of diffusion. Let's take a look and see what this professor is saying. He says, in short, diffusion is convincingly demonstrated when a resemblance are numerous, the similarities compared are highly distinctive or usual or unusual. Sorry. The course of diffusion is clear. However, though the union of all three conditions is always desirable for a satisfactory proof, most scholars are willing to assume diffusion on lesser grounds, regardless of the occurrence of other parallels of discontinuous distribution. A single trait may have strike them as a so extraordinary that they must explain its presence in distinct places by spread from a center, or they may be content with the assuming diffusion when the two phenomena or a whole culture compared share several, though not necessarily very distinctive elements. The later procedure of is doubtful value unless there is at least one decisive link in a chain of evidence. So, testing the Igbo data for the diffusion of Egyptian culture by Professor Lowry's rule item has to be ignored because only a specific aspect of the fusion of Egyptian culture is being considered. However, the resemblances are very numerous, and I may refer to some, namely the divine kingship, the dual organization in Africa, the winged solar disk, as well as the cowrie, and many other resemblances found among the Igbo. So far as B is concerned, the similarities are highly distinctive, suggestional notation linked to an exotic found on the shores of Egyptian empire. The course of the diffusion is clear, east to west, following the trend of main trade routes. On the strength of the evidence marshaled, I put forward the claim that the use of sexagenal notation in dealing with the cowrie among the Igbo of West Africa is due to the diffusion of Egypt, he writes. That's what he says. So, why would I even introduce this into the argument is because I do take the position based on the amount of evidence and how things are going to transpire. We're probably going to see this come up, and we're probably going to see the religious mindset, because they're not going to watch the Masi. And that's fine. But you're going to see them make this error. And earlier, when we dealt with the archaeologists in regard to the cowrie shell, they told us in the conclusion that it would be very incorrect. It would be not incorrect. They said problematic for someone to take something from someplace and then shoot it all the way across into the New World. But in this instance, that's this person's argument. But this, we're gonna see what they're really trying to argue here, especially with the cowrie. So We go to another article here, and I'm not going to give you all of this. I should have just gave you the abstract version of this, which I probably will. But like I said, all of this is in the description of the particular video. So you can get it and you can do as you see fit with it. And you can use it to, if you want to argue with somebody, you could use, I'm not going to do it. If you want to use it to argue with someone, you can. If not, or you get in the middle of hearing a conversation and you see these people are misrepresenting the sources or illegitimately misleading people astray, then you could deal with it. But this article is about materials related to the Cowerie currency of the Western Sudan. So reflections of the province and the diffusion of the Cowerie in the Sahara and the Sudan. So you're hearing the word diffusion come up a lot. This is going to deal with those two important Cowerie shells that we've already talked about, the Annalus and the Monte. I'm telling you how significant they are. You see them here in the middle here. They're very significant in this whole thought process of what some people are trying to link. So let me get to the purpose of the study. The purpose of the study is to investigate the Cowerie in Western Sudan, but it's impossible to study any aspect of Cowerie diffusion and use in isolation. And some understanding of the complex and fascinating global history of shale is essential to our knowledge of its history in the area. Since there are several species and many subspecies of the Cowerie, we are concerned only with Annalus and Monte. Everybody should know by now that Annalus and Monte come from the Indo-Pacific area. One enters East Africa a lot earlier. The other one enters West Africa around the 19th century. That we know via, European presence. They come in there with it. Arab presence, and then the Europeans come in later on. It says the use of the Cowerie is old as intelligent man. For Jackson tells us the association of perforated Cowerie shells with men belonging to the Cro-Magnon group is not without interest when it is remembered that these people were members of our own species. Homo sapiens quite distinct from the early Neanderthal people. With the era of civilized man, they have been found with the pre-dynastic and dynastic burials in Egypt. And Jackson suggests the possibility that the Annalus found in the grave at Abydos may have been used as money. Shells have been found in Tucson graves and were used by the women of Pompeii as prophylactic against sterility. Jackson suggests on the evidence of the discovery of medieval graves of women in Europe that this use may have persisted in the Middle Ages. They have been found again in Anglo-Saxon graves. The Carthaginians used the shells for they have been dug up in the Punic graves, and the Romans appear to have given them the nickname porci or porcelu, piglet, which has been passed through the Low Latin or early Italian porcelaine to the French porcelain, and thus into English porcelain. Indeed, Jackson suggests that the Romans may themselves have taken the nickname from the Greeks. All right, on the other side of the world, cowries were known from a very early times in China and India, and in Sanskrit, Kiparda, from which our own cowrie is thought ultimately to have derived. Maybe as an authority suggests the Chinese loan word for hope. Cowries have been found at the site of Nimrod. Yep, that's what it says. In Transcaucasia and the Crete, Turkestani, and Scandinavian. Indeed, it is apparent that this tiny, rotund, and pleasing object has accompanied man throughout countless centuries of his development and has been intimately involved in his emotional life and the daily business of living. The passive Cowerie diffusions diffusions have been delineated by Jackson as a classic work. The Quegan states westward from India, they spread throughout Afghanistan into Persia and from thence to Europe, where they encountered the stream that had tricked up the prehistoric times, probably connected with the amber trade. He goes on to say, and I'm going to give you a little bit more, and I'm going to cool on this one, but what they were initially used for and the reasons is obscure. Despite Jackson's sermons, it seems doubtful whether they were really used by the ancient Egyptians as currency. Certainly, they were valued at an early date as charms, which learned discussions place in man over the period of 39 to 43 as to whether the cowrie was as a charm against evil eye because it resembled a half-closed eye, or prophylactic against infertility because of the resemblance to the female vulva. This correspondence has been summarized by Gobert in an article in which what noble scholarship he demonstrates convincingly that behind the magical and life-giving properties attributed to the cowries lies an old age concept of le pudum magica. So I'm gonna stop right there. I'm gonna need y'all to get into that if you want to get a little bit further. This is only preparing you for what is about to occur, especially when it comes to the cowries. Letting y'all know that. In closing, there's a 24-page article written by, and I didn't get to that other article, and I really should have, but hold up, y'all. I'm trying to get my Zoom on. I want to go 200, and I want to go presentation, and it still didn't do it. Double tap. All right, so they ain't gonna let me go too far zoom on the presentation mode. That's fine. So let me do this. I don't even want to download this right now because I can see it in presentation mode, but y'all can't. But anyway, maybe that helped come out of that a little bit. I think y'all should be able to see that. So this deals with marine shell working at Harley, Ethiopia, and the implications for Red Sea trade. You know, when we're talking about these two different cowries in particular, especially their presence in these areas that we're discussing, right? And we're making these linkages, you know, we need to figure this out. Now, I'm gonna tell y'all this because I have the source. I have Timothy Insal's work, especially as it regards to the presence of Islam in early Africa. So when he talks about trade in early Africa, he talks about the Red Sea and how they traded in that area and what was used in that trade. So if you have Insal's work, I can show you. I got the book. It gets into that, but in this instance, right? We're talking about these shells, so I'm gonna give you the abstract, and I'm not gonna go too far. We're going to continue to see. Yo, Ben, this is how you know you're on the right track with certain sources, because we continue to see Ogundaran's name pop up in almost every scholarly work. If Ogundaran name doesn't pop up, if Hojadorn and Johnson's name doesn't pop up, and Johnson and it's another one that doesn't pop up in regard to this subject matter, it's almost as if we need to question the validity of the information that is coming from those other sources. All right, so it says 12 species of marine shell were transported in significant quantities from the Red Sea to trade centers of our land in eastern Ethiopia between the 11th and early 15th century AD. Initially, it was thought that the species such as the cowries were imported from the Indian Oceans. Subsequent research has found that all were available from the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden, east of Harla. All right. Now it says this suggests that a hitherto largely unrecognized source of marine shells were available, and the Red Sea might have supplied not only the Horn of Africa, but other markets, potentially including Egypt, and from these elsewhere in North Africa and ultimately West Africa via trans-Saharan routes, as well as Nubia and further south of the Nile in the Sudan and the Arabian Peninsula. And let me see here, in the four net first down, and the Arabian Persian Gulf. This is explored with reference to the shell assemblages from Harla and selected shell assemblages from elsewhere in the Horn of Africa and trading centers on the Red Sea. This is unique, ladies and gentlemen. So, just to kind of give you some wiggle rooms here. I mean, he writes about this in his book too. This is in his book too. So no faking, no fronting, none of that. He deals specifically with this Horn of Africa, this over here, this Red Sea stuff, and especially coming up through this gap right here where he's talking about this whole Ethiopian thing. Also gets to the early in the 7th century. You have the earliest presence of Islam in Africa. And we know this because of burial sites, right? We have the archaeological evidence for burial sites, ornaments, and otherwise of Islamic influence, which means that these people came there and brought with them their material culture, which didn't really survive in this particular area, so to say. But because of the closeness of it, it took time and it developed. It wasn't an early onset. It was it took some centuries later for them to have some type of people or influence in the area and get them over there. But when you studying Islam, you get into that. And oh yeah, I do have my book is done. It's been done for a while for those of you who are ready for that work. The coming of Islam in Balad al Sudan. You might see some particulars that come up in reference to trade and things of that nature, because that was an intricate point of the coming of Islam. And what we're talking about right now, this cowrie shell stuff, is evidence of such, because those two main cowries are what important. We said that probably 2 hours ago. I know I've been on for at least 2 hours. So I suggest those of you who are getting prepared to hear about this so-called Africans was everywhere, or the cowrie shells show the presence of Africans in the New World before the slave trade. All of that, I'm telling you right now, you better not let them get away with trying to say that some cowrie shells is evidence of Africans, the presence of Africans in the New World before these Europeans and so forth. Them shells don't come until enslaved Africans are on the set. And I took you from west, intentionally from west, and we walked back to the east for a reason. I really didn't get too far into this work, which is some good work right here done by Insol. But I already have the book, and I just wanted to share with y'all that there's actually published studies in regarding to cowrie shells and their existence on the continent of Africa. Now, the use of cowrie shells and its importance to our ancestors and even up until today is a different conversation culturally, right? So when we're having this discussion, we can deal with the archaeology, and we can deal, the material culture and things of that nature and its onset in different stages. However, I don't want to, get you too far from that. That's one other aspect of how we use things. But the presence of the significance of these two particular cowrie shells were extraordinary in the emergence of how it moved, how we use shells early on as decorative items to, you know, things that go in your hair, and then from your hair into currency, and then, you know, divination and all of those things. There's so many different aspects to talk about how we use the shell. Is crazy ridiculous. But the emerge, as you can see from our logo, as you can see from the logo, the Masawari clan logo, what's on there? The mask. Ben got the mask, the similar mask, the same mask. It's got the cowrie shells on there. It's indicative. It has significant meaning to us. However, you know, we ain't got to play the game all the way out to say that, you know what I'm saying, the shell shows up because Africans was already here. We ain't got to do none of that. Like, there's no reason for that. So I'm telling people right now, you got the information, tread, you can have them, you can make them, force them to tread lightly on the subject matter, because they could get a lot of things wrong and they can create problematic arguments. And if for anyone insinuating that we were here before being enslaved and we were doing trade and the cowrie shell is evidence of that, is out of their damn mind. So I appreciate everybody tuning in to this particular episode. I might be on later with my science with Sean and get into a little COVID-19 vaccines and its implications or its impact on fertility. Again, I don't know why. But you know, we got some you heard my email click, so I actually have some information that actually popped up regarding COVID-19 vaccines does not impact fertility for those of them that are out there saying something, but we have the latest science on the subject matter. And you know, I want to share that information with a lot of people in regard to that on the Science with Sean channel. So yeah, man, it's the best logo because you made it. But I appreciate everybody for tuning in. You know, like the show, share the show, tell a friend, tell a friend. Get yourself prepared for the conversation. The argument is coming. It's coming. The claims are coming. And hopefully, if you guys missed the conversation last night on Facebook Live, it was aired. It will be once Brother Vance get the video together, get it edited, and you know, put his touches on the video and get it right. It should show up in a couple of places and it'll be uploaded across all our networks. And you know, check those things out, man. Also, don't forget to go to Same Tree Different Branch Publishing. Go into the bookstore and purchase all of our published books. Chavis is the latest with a book. You know, you want to make sure that you get his book. It's out. Go get Chavis' work. You know, we just dropped a comprehension book as well. Make sure you go get that work. You know, we got what SARS-CoV-2 taught me out there. If you ain't got your copy of that, you tripping. Just make sure you go and pick up Black Panthers Volume 1 and 2 work, the first Pan-African journal in the community, right? Killmonger's Corner. Get part 1 and part 2. We got some beautiful work in there. People sleeping on that. You know what I mean? I think you need to get into that right now if you want to make some noise for real. And you know, go check out our sister Alima's poetry book. You know what I'm saying? Let me hold up 1 second. Let me help a lot of y'all out. We got books everywhere. We the real meaning of book though. MEK got a book. Aunt got a book. Magi got a book. Michael Hawk got a book. Know about a saw. We ain't got to talk about a saw. You know what I'm saying? Wu got a book. Wu owe us a book. Get your perceptions of a misplaced African, Volume 1. We waiting on Volume 2 from Sister Alima. You know what I'm saying? Maybe she'll have time to give us the Volume 2. Jehudi got a book. He ain't even gonna put it out for y'all. You know, Kofi got a book. Sutek working on a book. Nahisi got a book. He working on another book. I don't know. We got a whole lot going on, man. I ain't gonna lie to y'all, man. We about our business. So tap in, you know, get what you're gonna get. And Rockwood is all the way. He said, I gotta wait to tax season. Y'all trying to break me with all them books. Appreciate Sister Ladosha being in the building. You know what I'm saying? Sister Ladosha can get into the cowrie shells, and it's important with Africans' health. You know what I'm saying? Look out for that. Look out for Sister Ladosha. You know what I'm saying? Getting ready to drop that on us. But on that note, man, y'all already know what it is, man. Enjoy the rest of y'all day.
Carter on the beat.